And I'm going to talk a lot today about your residential property tax and how we can utilize these tools to keep your residential property tax from going up. So it comes out of a project area that a city or a county creates, and it goes towards economic development or public improvement projects within the community. But the only one paying for that is out of that actual project area. And it's based off of future tax revenues. So not current tax revenues, but future tax revenues. In Utah, the tax increment finance subsidies are not appropriated directly from a city or a county's budget. So these are not funds that come out of your general fund. These are basically rebates. They're a post-performance property tax rebate. They're issued by the Community Reinvestment Agency. So in order to participate in this type of financing, you have to create in the state of Utah what's called a Community Reinvestment Agency. So let me give you a little bit more of a visual on what tax increment finance is, and then we'll talk about the specifics relative to community reinvestment agencies. This is a really good diagram. When you're looking at tax increment finance, your property has a base tax value, and the city or the county that's utilizing tax increment finance, they're always going to get that baseline value, what that property is listed at the time that what we call it, the tax increment is triggered. So your baseline property value is figured out before you create the project area, and that's retained through the entire project, that baseline value. So you're always going to get, the city or the county is always going to get that tax appropriation given back to them. Your increment, which is what we leverage for these development projects, is that middle graph. And it's that middle triangle. And that's the increase in taxable value based off of the development project that's going onto that piece of property, or properties plural. So your increment is what we leverage to create that rebate that's given post-performance. So once your project ends and then the project area not only receives the taxable base value, but they also get the total taxable value of the project after it's completed. So a lot of times we'll see this huge leap, and I'll give you an example in our West Beaver Corridor. A lot of our properties are in Greenbelt, so they fall under farmland, so we have properties that are like 500 acres that pay like $2,000 a year in taxes. So that baseline is $2,000 a year that keeps going back to the county. So say we bring in a large development project, commercial development or industrial development project onto a piece of property that's in Greenbelt. We rezone that property, but we still keep that Greenbelt value as the baseline. So any increment from 2000 to the end of the project is what we have to play with in the county to reinvest back into that area for development. So the county recently updated their CRA policy and their tax increment policy. And we just tightened it up one more time in the last couple of weeks. So we'll be putting that out for a vote pretty soon. We do not use county tax increment to incentivize developers to come. A lot of cities and counties do that, and it's completely legal, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we want to see that tax increment invested right back into that property as public infrastructure. So recently we have tightened up our tax increment finance policies and processes to include an assessment of the project and to also add in very specific clawbacks, sunset terms, and reporting components. The state statute doesn't require that, but our agreement and our policy with Weber County does require that now. So if you're a developer and you come out and say you want a portion of that tax increment, we're going to assess your project. We're going to look at that project and we're going to say, okay, you need about $10 million of infrastructure for your project to happen. So we're willing to give you a rebate on the development project, on the infrastructure you're going to put in. We're willing to give you a rebate of 50% of that tax increment for 10 years. And that's where we're starting. We also dropped our cap, by the way. So Weber County is our starting and ending point is 0 to 50% for 10 years. Unless it has a significant, and I'm talking significant regional impact, we're not going to go above and beyond 50% for the 10 years. So that's the agreement that we would make with a developer. So for the 10 years, you're going to see that little triangle grow. And at the end of 10 years, we're done. And that improved property went from, say, $2,000 a year in the tax base. Say we put a very large industrial or a data center on that property, and we've increased the value of that property from 2,000 to a taxable value of around 2 to 25 million. We're going to get that full 25 million increment at the end of 10 years. In the meantime, we're only going to get 50% of that increment. So that's how tax increment works. You're always going to get your baseline value, and then you get to negotiate what that triangle looks like as a city. And in the case of the county, we've gotten really strict on how we do our negotiations. We've put what we call some guardrails in. And those guardrails is we now have a new assessment that they have to go through. So we assess the project based on criteria that the county wants to see in these project areas. And it could be like job creation, infrastructure development. Does it conform with our Western Weber general plan if we're looking at a project out in our Western Weber corridor? So we create these criteria, we rank the criteria, and then that tells us what percentage of the increment we're willing to give back into the project area for a particular project. So you can see that they're very valuable because it allows development to happen, and it allows that increased tax base to happen at an incremental rate. And it provides an opportunity for the city or the county to work with developers in order to get the right type of infrastructure in that's not just going to benefit that one specific project, but can benefit the surrounding areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with PIDs. Does anyone have any questions so far? I'm happy to answer questions as we go. Sure. And told that the agricultural value until the project is done, and then right now when you go out and rebuild, you have to go back 3 years on taxable value. Yeah. Send that back. How does that play into this, or does it? It doesn't. You don't have to go back. Yeah, no, that's a great question. We get that question a lot. No, the way that we set up the agreement, we have what's called the trigger date, and we trigger that tax value at that date. And we also put that into our interlocals. Based on the project, you have a year or two to trigger. If you don't, the project area just disappears. But great question. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Yeah. Yeah, because typically with these large projects, the property is going to continue in value. So, and this is why we kind of put the project through a rigorous assessment. We want to make sure that the projects we're giving this tax increment to are going to be sustainable, long-term sustainability. So the property is going to get improved on. Say we're putting some type of a manufacturing facility out in our corridor. The property is going to continuously grow and develop. The jobs are going to grow and develop. So the value of that property, the real and personal property, is going to continue to go up. I mean, it could level off a little bit, but most often it continues to just grow and provide more value. But good question. So in order to use tax increment finance in the state of Utah, you have to create a community reinvestment agency. Cities and counties have the statutory authority to do that. And I'll go over kind of what that looks like. And this is a really watered down version of the process. The process is very strict, and it's outlined in the state statute. This is kind of, it gives you a general idea of how these are created and how they're managed and what they're used for. So the CRA, that's what we call them, is the authorized entity that creates project areas and budgets. So in order to be able to even allocate tax increment, you have to have a community reinvestment agency. They used to be called RDAs. You might still hear RDA. But a couple years ago, the state came in and just relabeled all of them CRAs. So they're political subdivisions of the state. They're created by the legislative body of a county or municipality. They're specifically for the purpose of stimulating redevelopment and assisting with infrastructure. So just giving away your tax increment to a developer is not a best practice. And we do see that, which is one of the reasons why the county came in the last year and we have just tightened the belt on that. We want to see this tax increment going right back into that project area and utilizing not just for that development or that developer, but utilizing it for the entire city or county. So the governing board of the CRA is your legislative, your city or your county's legislative body. So Weber County's CRA is managed by our 3 commissioners. If Hooper was to create a CRA, it would be managed by your mayor and council. So let's talk a little bit about the tax increment finance and how it dovetails with the CRA. So the CRA, which is that legislative body that's created when the project area and budget are adopted. So that CRA administers the tax increment financing. And they do that by creating project areas. So there's lots of different ways you can create project areas. A city, and Ogden City does this a lot. They go and preemptively create project areas. So they identify areas that they'd like to see development projects happen in and that need significant infrastructure or in the case of Ogden City, they're utilizing their Make Ogden general plan. So they identify these specific areas and they map them out and they kind of do like, what would this look like in the future? And what type of businesses and development do we want to recruit into this project area? So they actually have one person that manages all their CRAs for the city because it is a development arm of the city. So that's a really big example of how you can use a CRA where you go in and preemptively just say, this area is going to look like this. We're going to put it in a CRA for future development, and we're going to utilize this finance mechanism for any future development that happens in there. The county does not do that because we're not a city. We do it a little bit differently. We go in and do it project by project. So as we get projects approach us, we look at creating a project area for that specific project and making sure that that CRA is very defined for that specific project. And that's part of this new philosophy that we're taking with making sure that we have our interlocal agreements very tightly sealed. And that means that if the developer comes in and says, okay, we're going to build this, it's going to cost this, we're going to put in this infrastructure, we want tax increment for that. We'll assess that project and say yes or no, maybe, based on what they're proposing. We will then go into an interlocal agreement with the CRA board, which is our county commission, and we'll present a project area plan and budget. That project area plan and budget, once the CRA agency votes on that, then that becomes the document that is used. That becomes the roadmap that's used to create your interlocal agreements. So once again, we've tightened up that process on the county level. Our interlocal agreements have sunset clauses that says, well, developer, you didn't do what you said you're going to do, so we're not going to reimburse you that tax increment that we said we were going to reimburse you because you're in violation of the interlocal. They've got some clawbacks, which means that if they use the money for something they weren't supposed to use the money for, then we claw that money back. They've also got some public infrastructure requirements. So if they say they're going to come in and build a lift station and they come in and don't do that, we're not going to reimburse them for that. So that's what's great about the way that the Utah statute is set up. As a city and as a CRA board for your city, representing the city, you have the ability to custom make your interlocal agreement with each project area that you create. And it is your right to refuse to give out that tax increment if the developer does not meet the expectations and the agreement and that are outlined in the agreement. So I want everyone to understand that. And the other part about the CRA, please keep in mind, the only increment that's going back into that project area is with the participating properties in that project area. It's not coming from your general fund. It's not coming from your residents. It's only in that defined project area. That project area has to go through a definition process with the county, and it has to actually go through our surveyor's office, and it's actually designated and voted in. So that's how you maintain control over these types of incentives. These incentives should make a good project better, but they should not make or break a project's budget. And they should have an advantage to the city or the county that's giving them. They should have a public advantage, whether it be significant economic development for job creation and tax generation, but also for infrastructure needs. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that they truly are a great tool. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this tool, as well as PIDs, can take some of the property tax burden off of the city. And we'll get to that after I talk about PIDs. In order to create these, I'll get to you in just a second. In order to create these, you have to participate with taxing entities. So that's one of the fun parts of the job, is that you have to go to the taxing entities and ask them to participate. Weber County only asks the school district and the fire district. We don't ask the other taxing entities. I don't feel that it's the right thing to go and beg money from a cemetery district or a mosquito abatement district. I manage a sewer district out in the West Weber corridor. I don't want a CRA coming to me asking for what measly little taxes I collect. So we only hit up the larger taxing entities and the taxing entities that wouldn't be so affected by the project area and that would also benefit from the project. So schools benefit greatly from industrial and commercial development because they do not benefit from residential development. So we have a lot of participation from our schools and our fire district. A lot of times too, we'll put little clauses inside of the agreements that specific amount of funding has to go back to the fire district in different forms. Like one of our areas out in the West Weber corridor, they're going to have to designate 2 acres to the fire district to build a new fire station. So you can structure your interlocal agreement any way you want. It's up to you as a community reinvestment agency to put that together, because ultimately that money goes back to the community reinvestment agency. It doesn't go back to the developer. The CRA then doles out the money to the developer. The county's not going to send that money to the developer because we issue all this tax increment. It's going to issue it right back to the city. And right back to the city CRA. You can't put it in your general fund either. It has to stay in the project area. It is absolutely illegal to take that money and put it anywhere outside that project area. Ms. Prince? Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, and that's why we call it post-performance. Yes, you're absolutely correct about that. I will say this, and this is just my Stephanie Russell's personal professional opinion. It is not a best practice for a city to invest in a private project. Now, if you're partnering with the project to put in public infrastructure, that's something you would want to consider. But Utah has CRAs and PIDs for the sole purpose of not putting that back on the taxpayer. If you bond for a developer, you're on the hook. The city's on the hook for that bond. And they can walk away from the project and you're stuck with that. And your taxpayers are stuck with that bond. And this is when PIDs really come into play. because they offer a way for the city to have a bonding mechanism that is completely risk-free. So I'll get to that. Great question and great comment. Any other comments about series and tax increment before we move on to PIDs? Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, that just happened last week. And there's a lot of fallout from it. But let me tell you this. These are not mandatory. You are under no obligation as a city or a taxing entity to participate in a CRA. That's up to your legislative bodies. So yeah, that happened last week. Yes. Yeah. So one of the things we don't do as a county is we don't create these areas until we have a commitment from the districts that are participating via a resolution or an interlocal agreement. That's part of our new policy. So sometimes the cities will go and create these districts, and then they sit dormant because the taxing entities say, no, we're not participating. But yeah, great observation. No, that's not written in stone. It's kind of it's kind of a general rule that we follow. Yeah. And yeah, so and a lot of the taxing entities won't participate unless the county is participating. So when I go out to sell these, because I represent the county and I have to go sell these, and that's another thing too, your developers don't represent you. So they don't have a right to go to the school district before you guys do. They don't have a right to go to any of the district taxing entities before you do. And that's something that's happens in Utah a lot. And I just want to make sure you guys understand that is your community reinvestment agency's responsibility, not the developers. They have no legal authority to represent the CRA, none, zero. So when you're in negotiations with these, sometimes you have to, and sometimes these developers are from out of state, so every state does it differently. You have to, and I've had, with this particular one, I had to say, no, you will not be going and contacting the school district on behalf of the county. That's my job. And that's the commission. I serve at the commission's pleasure. And if they don't want me going to the school district, I don't go to the school district. So that's something, please keep that in mind as you guys are considering doing this, that you have full control over this. It is not the developer's incentive. It is the incentive, and it's the authority of the Community Reinvestment Agency to put these together and to create those relationships with the different districts and create those partnerships with the different districts. All right, moving on to public infrastructure districts. These are complicated, but they're not. So feel free to ask me questions at any point. These are I love public infrastructure districts. And I'll talk about the downfalls of them, but I'm going to talk a lot about why they're very valuable. So PIDs were created in 2019, and they're part of the limited purpose local governments chapter of 17D. So this statute grants cities and counties the authority to create PIDs to finance public infrastructure for new development and redevelopment. Public infrastructure districts are just that. They are a finance tool. They can issue debt, which can be repaid through additional property taxes applied only to the properties in the public infrastructure district. And the PIDs require 100% of property owner participation. So if your developer wants to create a PID, they're going to petition you and they're going to say, this is our project area, and 100% of the property owners have to agree to that additional millage rate on their property. So they're agreeing to have their property tax an additional millage rate. And I'll tell you why they want to do that. The debt for a PID is not held by the city or the county. It is, and it's actually not even held by the developer. It is literally held by the public infrastructure district. So think of it as kind of a local district. It's their own, it's an own separate entity. They're independent political subdivisions that the state allows to create that can work with the county or the city to leverage an additional millage. That millage rate is pledged to help pay off any bonds that they take out to do the public infrastructure. Does that make sense? So very different from CRAs. They're totally separate avenues. They're totally separate roads. I'm going to talk to you how they intersect, because they do intersect. The state allows that, but they're created very differently. They have completely different purposes. They are not governed by a city except for through a governing document, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. And they're have a very specific purpose, and they are not created in perpetuity. They expire. So they're used to finance the construction and improvement of public amenities like parks, public transportation, community centers. Basically, I like to say water, sewer, roads, parks, trails. And last year, I ran some legislation with Senator Stevenson, and we were able to get some electricity and natural gas infrastructure added into the PID policy, which is fantastic because that's a big issue with a lot of our development projects is they don't have any infrastructure connected to them at all. So it's only for infrastructure, and it's public infrastructure. So that means that you're going to work with them and tell them what you want. They're going to put their infrastructure in, and then you're going to say, well, that's nice, but it needs to be used for a public purpose. And that might be road improvements that go into the project. That might be community sewer that's used by the project, but also used by a different developer or used in the city. Out in our West River corridor, we've got a PID that we created. They're upsizing a park for the park district. They're putting in a regional water tank. They're putting in a regional substation. They're putting in regional sewer lines, regional water lines, and doing all the road improvements on the outside of their property that counties asked for. That's the only reason we created that PID for them, because we're getting something out of it. And once again, county's not on the hook for that. So they can be used to fund all of these types of things. They can also be used to fund aging infrastructure. So going in and doing improvements on sites, which is really great. If you've got, you know, we don't see it too much as you used to, but if you've got infrastructure that needs to be upsized or just removed and replaced, you can add that into the PID governing document. So it can even be adjacent to, it doesn't have to be inside the PID, it just has to be in part of the governing document. So once again, this is a way for a city or a county to really fix some of their infrastructure needs by doing what we call public-private partnerships. And everyone answered this question for me. Is the city on the hook for the bonds? Nope. Just the PID. And they use that additional millage rate to back the bonds when they go to the market. The other thing they can use to back bonds to go to the market is tax increment finance. So if you have a project area and you create a project area for a developer that's in a CRA, and then you create a PID, which you can create in that same area, or the boundaries don't have to match exactly, by the way, then that developer, or excuse me, I say developer, but I really mean the PID. When the PID goes to the bond market, it's generally the developer that sits on the board of the PID. When that PID goes to the bond market, they can back those revenue bonds off of the increment from the CRA, and they can do a portion of it. They can do the whole thing, doesn't matter. Or they can back it off of, or they can back it off of the millage rate that they used to increase their property taxes for that area. So you have two mechanisms that do not affect city taxpayers or the city at all. These are solely coming out of the project areas. So tax increment finance doesn't exist unless the project happens. That's money you wouldn't have unless the project happens. And PID funding is the developer putting their own millage leverage on their property so they can back bonds and provide the city with right-sized infrastructure. These are really great tools, but you need to know your rights as a city, and you need to know how to negotiate these deals. This is a negotiation. Both of these require negotiation. So let's talk a little bit about what they can and can't do. They can issue bonds to pay for the cost of public infrastructure. They can enter into interlocal agreements. So once again, they're kind of their own district. They're given that power by the state. They can acquire completely or partially completed projects. But something you've got to take into consideration is that they can only do what you allow them to do in the governing document. It's really important, just like your interlocal agreement for a CRA, to have those clawbacks and those sunset terms and reporting clauses. You want to do the same thing with your governing document. Make sure that that thing is exactly how you want it. And in your governing document, it says, this is what this PID is allowed to do, and this is what this PID is going to deliver. And this is what happens if the PID doesn't deliver. And it's the same thing you do with your CRA interlocal. So they're basically the same. They're just totally separate statutes, totally separate ways to create them, but they're kind of managed the same. PIDs cannot own the infrastructure. Once that infrastructure is built, and we actually put this in our governing document, we want to know who's taking that infrastructure after the developer builds it. I want to know. I'm not going to just let you go out there and build infrastructure randomly without knowing who's going to take that and who's going to sign off on it. So in our governing document for PIDs, we say, we're not going to create this until you have an interlocal agreement with one of the districts or the county saying that they're going to take and maintain that infrastructure in perpetuity. That's where the perpetuity clause comes in. Once that infrastructure is developed, it's no longer the PIDs, but it will belong to a different governing body in perpetuity. PIDs cannot be a financial liability for the city, the county, or the state. They are their own financial liability. These go out to bond, and they're basically junk bonds. So investors will invest in these, and it's at the total risk of the PID and the investor. If they crash and burn and they aren't able to pay off their bond, the city is not affected. Maybe a little PR affected, but financially not affected. They operate outside the constraints of local government. They cannot operate outside the constraints of local government or oversight of code and state law. So they can't go in and do land use changes. They have to follow your ordinances to the letter of the law. They are a finance mechanism. So you tell them what you want and you allow them to be created, and then you govern them with the document, and then you govern them with your actual development codes. So in ours always say they have to be in compliance with our Western Weber general plan. They have to be in compliance, depending on what piece, with Weber County's engineering has to sign off on all pieces of it. So we have a process that the PID has to go through in order to create the infrastructure and get it built. It would be the same thing as a development agreement, if that makes a lot of sense. And we don't create these without doing a development agreement first. So the development agreement gets put into place for the development project, and then whatever pieces of the development agreement that the PID are going to pay for, we put those in the governing document. Does that make sense? So once again, as a city or county, you do not have to create these, but there's some advantages to creating these. Malcolm, can you switch over to that other slide? And let's talk a little bit about Hooper and why these could be some really good opportunities for you to start looking at as you're looking at bringing in some development projects. Can you make that just a little bit bigger? So I compiled a list of city property certified tax rates in Weber County, just so you guys can kind of see what property taxes and rates look like in the county. And I also included real taxable values and populations, just so that you can kind of get a snapshot of your surrounding areas and what they look like as part of the Weber County family. We want to make sure that you guys are successful and that you're bringing in the right type of development for your community and that you're being really savvy about the way that you're recruiting and the way that you're structuring these types of incentives. So we're here to be a guide for you and to answer questions and to be a good development partner, because we want you to be successful and thrive for long term. So you guys can see your property tax rate's pretty low compared to some of the other cities, except for Merritt, Slaterville, and West Haven. They're as low as it gets. Well, I guess they could get just rebate money to their residents, but and then I was actually really impressed with your real taxable values on your properties. That's look at you guys compared to look at your population compared to some of our other cities. You know, you've got some really valuable properties here, and that's fantastic. So I'm going to hop right down here and talk a little bit about the difference between residential and commercial properties. So in Weber County, residential primary residence, there's a 45% exemption is applied to the market value of a home that is an owner's primary residence, and you probably all know that. So this means that the homeowner's taxable value is only 55% of the property's fair market value. Oh, one thing I didn't mention with our series, Weber County does not create CRAs for housing projects. Why? Why would we not do that? Yeah, we need the property tax because we only get 55%. Yes, that would be up to the city if you guys wanted to do that. And traditional mixed use is not so much, here's a housing project, here's a commercial. It's here's commercial with housing on top or on the parcel, like mixed into the development. Does that make sense? So it's more so much that, yeah, like I wouldn't, if you had, it could be the same developer, but we'd want to see that that was interfaced. I recently, we had a developer come and do a proposal, and I flat out told them, I said, unless you put houses on like apartments or townhomes or condos on top of the retail that you're proposing, I'm not even going to consider. Yeah, something like that where you've got walkable commercial development where you're generating sales tax and commercial, and this is why. Mm-hmm. And it really depends on how our assessor views it. So the second line, commercial properties, these properties include real estate and business personal property and are assessed 100% of their market value. So if our assessor comes back and says, no, we're not going to assess that as a commercial property, we're going to assess that as a primary residential property, I'm not going to offer a tax incentive. Does that make sense? So this is where the CRAs come in really handy. So variations can consider factors like the property's potential to generate income over time, and this is known as the income approach. So working with our assessor, we can have a pretty good idea of what that property is going to generate with a specific type of development on that over a long period of time, which is why we would consider doing tax increment finance on a commercial development property, because they bring in a significant amount of tax increment, because they start off at a very low base value, and then they come in and put that development project in, and there's other factors to consider too. Job creation, long-term sustainability, infrastructure improvements that affect not just that parcel, but the surrounding areas. So those are the things that we take into consideration when we're assessing one of these projects for tax increment finance. So the reason I wanted to show you guys this was currently, let's look at our property tax increases for Hooper City. Currently, you guys are pulling in a measly $288,000 in property in property taxes into your general fund. That's not a lot. And you do have some really great properties in your area. So as we're looking at ways to facilitate an increase in property tax revenue into your city, you can do it a couple ways. You can just flat out raise the property tax on your residents. And that's what the next, the graph right below that looks like. If you look at 10, 25, 50, or 1 mil, I don't think that this is going to fly, because if I saw this as a property owner, I'd be down here screaming at city mayor and city, if you raised my property taxes a mil, because that's going to up my value 300, that's going to up my payment, my annual payment 300 approximately. These are just averages and estimates. Approximately $399 a year. I can tell you that we have people come in the county office and break down over like $50 a year. Yes, yes, it is. Yes, that's the additional rate. So this is why you want to consider doing PIDs and CRAs for development, because your commercial properties are going to bring you a significant bump in your tax. And I'm just talking about property tax today. Sales tax is a whole different scenario. But you will get an additional sales tax off of your commercial development. But I'm not going down that route today. Just specifically want to talk about how they work with CRAs, which we only do real and personal property tax for CRAs. So for you guys to look at opportunities to increase your tax base so that you can facilitate things like capital projects, hiring staff in needed positions, just your long-term sustainable, building up your reserves for emergencies. You want to augment that 288. It really is tiny. You want to augment that. And so but you want to be really strategic about it. So what we recommend, and this is what we practice in Weber County, we identify properties that would make really good project areas. And Ogden City does this as well. And this is why they create CRAs in advance. We don't do that. We just create land use and we create a general plan. So, and this is a really good use of your general plan, going through and identifying what properties and what areas you would like your commercial and industrial development, if you even want to go down that road, industrial development in, and what are the infrastructure lifts that are needed in those areas and the surrounding areas. So once you identify your needs and you identify the properties, then you can start having these discussions with developers. And if they match your vision of what you want, then you can have the discussions of creating PIDs and CRAs for these development projects. But you want to take into consideration how they're going to affect your tax base. And I have a whole process that we go through that I'm not going to share tonight because it's very lengthy, on how you determine whether or not a project is feasible for your city and for where you guys are at in your development process for long-term sustainability. So I just wanted to show you where you're at and how you can use these tools to keep from raising your property taxes in this area. If you want to accomplish very specific goals, maybe some infrastructure improvement projects, maybe some just getting your general fund reserve revenue back up to a workable, like sustainable level. I'm sure that if you started holding some town halls and asking what types of improvements you'd like to see in the city, you'd start getting some really great input from your public. And you can take that feedback and you can look at specific properties that can be developed out. And I know we had talked about updating your general plan and including exactly what you want in your areas, and then going out and finding the developers that meet the vision of your city and moving forward with these tools in a very proactive and a very controlled fashion. That's my presentation. Any questions? Yeah, so the city never gives up its sovereignty at all. It's not possible. Um, because it's a finance tool. It's not a it has they don't have any authority other than to build the infrastructure and to finance the infrastructure. That is all they're allowed to do. And I did tell you I was going to talk about the negatives of PIDs. So one of the things we changed in our PID policy very recently is so we have a cap on our mill rate. The state allows you to go up to 15 mills. Wrap your head around that. I showed you what 1 mill looks like for your property owners, right? Put times that times 15. Yeah, scary, huh? Yeah. So in each city that wants to participate in PIDs has to create a policy. In our policy, we say that you cannot exceed 5 mils. But I changed that recently. That's only for commercial industrial projects. So what happens when you do a PID for a subdivision? Who pays off that millage rate on that bond? Who pays the bond? The people who buy the houses, right? Yes, there's disclosure laws in place. But I don't know about you, but when I signed my closing documents, you think I read any of that? Yeah, exactly. So recently, we've dropped that down that any of our housing subdivisions that want to create PIDs can only leverage 2.5 mils as a max. And that's where PIDs have gotten a black eye. A lot of when it first came out of the gate, these communities were just going wild with this. And they didn't have tight governing documents. And residents are having to pay for public infrastructure that's outside of their subdivision. So if you're outside the subdivision, say you're just across the street, oh, wow, I just got a new sewer system and a new public park for free at the expense of these homeowners. And these newer homes are traditionally, a lot of them are going towards younger people. So you get a young person in there, a young family in there, and they get their property tax bill and they're like, oh, ouch. So that's something to take in consideration is when you're creating your PID policy, um, that you're looking very closely at what you really want to allow developers to do. And you can put all of that in your policy and in your governing document, like you mentioned. Absolutely. Mhm. No, you don't have to put no, because with the PID, remember that 100% of the property owners have to sign off. You would never want to include a subdivision, an already built out subdivision. The ones that are used for subdivisions are created with the developers who own all the property up front. And then as they subdivide and build those properties, then they're automatically already included, and that's where the cost comes. So like a project like what you have proposed for that particular space, that space would be the PID, but everyone around that would benefit from that public infrastructure. So say, I know that there's a needed lift station and some lines. And I know there's is it not completed subdivision that's near there, I think, Mayor, is that correct? 2? So they would be able to tie into that lift station and line, um, uh, and not have to pay the additional millage rate. Yep, you can set it up however you want. Yeah, completely. It's up to the mayor and council how they want to set that up. Yeah, yeah. But you could set it up where the new housing is contributing. That would be up to the mayor and council. Yes. Okay. And you can preemptively create that if you want. And a lot of cities do that. Cities will come in. It makes more sense for cities than counties because our swaths of land are very large, and where we're doing our development uh, is predominantly in the industrial core of West Weaver County. Or like the other PIDs and series we created are for ski resorts. They're large, big, giant pieces, but the cities will come to us with whole project areas that sometimes include housing. You can include housing in series. We don't do that. And we also don't participate in series that include housing. That's another thing we don't do. Yeah, you can create that in advance, or you can create it project by project. Or you don't create it at all. It's your choice. But a lot of cities do create the project. If they have a good general plan and they know what they want, yes, it's a best practice to create that in advance. I will tell you this, there's been a shift, and this is just because I go to the districts on occasion and market these. There's been a big shift in the districts, and you'll see that in the county as well. We don't want to create carte blanche. We want you to bring us a project and we'll deal with it on a project by project basis. And that's just a shift in general. But it is not it's not out of the ordinary to do that. Come on, hit me up. I'm here. Do you guys see how this is a benefit to your residential tax base to utilize these tools responsibly? Does that make sense? I do, but it's a conflict of interest if I was to consult with you. Absolutely. That's a free service my department offers. And I do have really good recommendations for consultants. Mhm. Absolutely. Mhm. Yeah, and I'll tell you what, not only should and not only could it should. And I'll tell you why, because I'm not going to take it to commission without that piece in it. Because that's the piece that Weber County would be willing to participate with is your regional infrastructure lift, not your private development infrastructure. We're going to want to look at road improvements, sewer improvements, water connectivity improvements, active transportation improvements that the project is going to bring to the area. And that's what the county is going to be wanting to see from your community reinvestment agency. And that's what's so important about your project area plan and budget is that you include those elements in that. And that is something I can handhold you guys through, is preparing that for our Economic Development Finance Committee. It's so funny that you bring that up. So I was at UAC 2 weeks ago and bumped into their new commissioner and maybe proposed that to him. So the answer to that is yes, there's definitely a potential. But you'd have to be very strategic about that. And once again, I'm gonna take off my county hat and put on my consultant hat. You're getting some free consulting tonight. That would be a really good use of a PID to create adjacent to that area and utilize your PID bond finance funding to tie into that lift station. So yeah. And that when we talk about regional infrastructure, that is regional infrastructure. Yeah. And you're providing long-term sustainable development on a regional scale. That's how you That's how you bump up your tax base. That's how you create those really great public-private partnerships and keep that tax burden off of your residents. So everyone gets new sewer and it's not coming out of personal property taxes, which is fantastic. So, and that's really the takeaway I'd like you guys to have tonight is that you're in full control of this, of both incentives. And there's ways to leverage them to get the infrastructure that you need and the development projects that you want. And a way to not have to raise your property taxes to increase your tax base, which is really the direction y'all need to start going in. Yeah, and you as a property owner, if you have a development project, you have the right to come and petition for a public infrastructure district. And you have the right to come and ask for a community reinvestment area to be created. Yeah, if you have a developer that you want to work with, for a PID, you would have to actually sign off on the PID because you're the actual property owner. But the developer can work with the city on creating a CRA because property owners don't have to sign off on CRAs. Oh, I can talk a little bit about that tonight if you want. Okay. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, they're doing environmental and they'll start doing right of way acquisition very soon. We just partnered with UDOT and WFRC. I run a task force for the Legacy Corridor, which is going to run all the way up through the county, through my project area, which is the West Weaver Corridor. And we just secured some funding for a feasibility study to update the 2009 study, which the 2009 study, if you haven't looked at it, it's got 6 routes going through that corridor. It is Commissioner Frower's last wish as his last year in commission next year that UDOT narrow it down to 1 and commit to it because we've got so much development going on out in that area. We can't afford to have UDOT come in 3 or 5 years and rip out brand new development. And they can if they don't have a designated route. And we want to make sure that that route is acknowledged by the state legislature. That's my update on that. So yes, if you know where that route's going to be and you're adjacent and you want to take advantage of development opportunities, commercial development opportunities on your properties, a PID and a CRA are absolutely the way to go. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so what I would recommend, and this is kind of what I said earlier, is that this becomes that public-private partnership. You would work with the city to identify properties for development, and then the city would work uh, internally and then even possibly externally to say, okay, what's our vision for this area? And then you look at your land use options and you look at feasibility and viability for those particular properties. I have a whole training session where I teach cities and stakeholders how to go through that process through different steps. We're not going to do that tonight, but if you guys want me to come back, I would be happy to come back and do that. It's a presentation. It's kind of a workshop. I do that for the cities as well in the county. But it helps you identify the process by which you go about doing sustainable, real development projects and utilizing tools and utilizing public-private partnerships to do that. Anything else? That was it, that we've got the feasibility study and we'll have some, hopefully by the end of next year, that route will be designated. Helps everybody. These are the properties we want to designate, and you can update your general plans. We're holding off to update our general plan. We're for the same reason. So yeah, and that gives you some time to work on looking at your infrastructure, looking at how you want to manage your growth and what type of growth you want to see here, and going through these what I call visioning charrettes, where you actually bring your public in and say, tell us what you want, and then you funnel that into, okay, what properties can we develop out that meet the vision, the overall vision and long-term strategy, and then what funding mechanisms can we use, and at the same time you're not just looking at, oh, this would make a good restaurant spot, but you're also saying, well, what type of infrastructure do we need to put into this corridor to make this sustainable long term? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my project area goes from 25 all the way up to Plain City and then completely west. In this, hopefully. Yeah, that you can see a lot of that on WFRC's website. We work really closely with them, and they're kind of spearheading that, how that's all going to interconnect. There's a lot of proposed. So the way that road development happens in Utah, WFRC has their general plans that they work with the cities and the counties on. Oh, Wasatch Front Regional Council. You can go on their website and pull up their transportation plan. They just adopted it last year, but they're always constantly updating it. So you can click on the road that you're looking at, the proposed road, and it'll tell you what phase it's in. If it's not a phase 1 or a 2, it doesn't go to the legislature for funding. So UDOT doesn't get it funded until it's bumped up to a phase 1 or 2. And there's criteria you have to use to get it bumped up to a phase 1 or a phase 2. So 4, but the 4 could be like 30 years out. Yeah. Yeah. And you can get the phases bumped, but you need someone who's annoying like me to do that. I annoyed him for a full 18 months before they finally bumped it up. Yeah, that part that ties into Hooper and then a little bit north of that. Yeah. Um, yeah, they're at 4,000 and then we're going to take the study on from there up. South, but I'm going to be honest with you. We're asking them to include 25 and up. Yeah, we're going to ask them to include 25 and up, even though that's the first time I heard 4,000 was today. It technically isn't set in stone, but That's their proposed, but we want them to do a little more. It's a fun partnership. Artery. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is why we want to include 25 because we have some issues with 25. So that's going to be part of the study area. Nothing's set in stone until the federal government says, yeah, your environmental is good to go. I actually don't know that. That's a good question. But so these meetings are open to the public. If you guys want to get on WFRC's website, and we'll be putting stakeholder teams together for this overall study. So, and we'll send that out to the mayors when we start that for stakeholder team engagement. So, which is possible, but honestly and truly, until they got tractors in the dirt. Yeah, so and they do that. They'll procure a lot and then they'll kind of go as it. They had some really big environmental issues in that Davis corridor that set them back significantly because they tried to go through areas that the federal government said absolutely not. So plans are plans. But until oh yeah, we absolutely do. Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's very controversial. Yeah. That's up to UDOT, how they, yeah, are they using Horrocks? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We do not. Mm-mm. Yes, we will consider mixed use, but once again, I have to go through our tax assessor to make sure that we're only using the commercial value. And it's gotta be, it depends on how our tax assessor is gonna assess the project. Yeah. We'd have to see the proposal and that'll go through my Economic Development Finance Committee and then the county commission has the final say. So yeah, I can just tell you generally, we don't support that, but each project is unique and each project has its own approval process and negotiation. Absolutely. So there's a couple different ways you can look at that. Can CRAs be abused? Absolutely. Which is why I stress that it's really important to have a policy in place before you start creating them. From a statutorial perspective, yes, they can be used as corporate welfare. And in the past, a lot of them were created by coming to this county and saying, but for, unless you give us this money, we're gonna lose this developer and they can't do this project, but for. We don't accept but for. And I'll tell you why. Because in Weaver County, we are not desperate ever. And I tell that to the cities I work with. You're not desperate. Pick a project that fits your vision, that benefits your community, that augments your infrastructure, and that's going to have a long-term sustainable component for your tax base. So that's why you have to really look at what's being proposed. And the school system does the same thing. So one thing that's kind of a misunderstanding, and trust me, I got a lot of phone calls when they had that tooth and taxation hearing. One thing that needs to be understood is that the reason the school district participates in some projects is because they don't have a negative impact on their taxes. They're totally separate buckets. So you've got one bucket, which is just their general taxes that they collect. And then the other bucket is the increment. The increment doesn't exist unless you participate in the project. Now you can argue that, well, if the developer is going to build the project, they're going to build the project, and then the increment does exist. Why are you giving it away? There's the reason you would do an agreement to participate, and the school district would do an agreement to participate, and their policy is similar to ours, is because we want to see good regional infrastructure go in. In your case, you've got this great piece of commercial property. If you were to create a CRA and or a PID, you're looking at augmenting all of that residential behind it. That's a win. That's a huge win, because you're going to increase your tax base from a commercial standpoint and from a residential standpoint. Would the school district probably participate in that? Yeah, because the housing is going to benefit, and they're going to benefit from that because they're going to keep getting that housing tax increase, and they're also going to get the commercial increase that they wouldn't have gotten. It wouldn't have existed. So you really have to, it's a balancing game. You have to really do a great assessment on the project to make sure it's a good fit. I would recommend that your city look at implementing a policy, not dissimilar to what we're doing on the county level, because our policy was fueled by the school district and the fire district and Central Weber's policies. In fact, Central Weber just borrowed my policy. They're going to update their policy, so that we're kind of all in lockstep on what we want to invest in. So that would be my recommendation. If you do PIDs, you have to, per state statute, you have to put a policy in place. Series you don't, but PIDs you do. It's just a best practice to do that for your CRAs. And some type of an assessment mechanism. Central Weber. Yeah, in fact, I sent Kevin our policy just a couple days ago for that, specifically for that meeting. And I know what project you're talking about. Mhm. And there's some instances where this is kind of interesting. That particular project, Sherry, when that project came before the county, that project, actually, we would be making money by giving away our increment. I know that sounds weird, but the amount of projected revenue that that project, because it was a retail project, was going to produce in sales tax, what we gave up in our property tax, we were going to get back 3 times in our sales tax. So you got to look at what the projections are and play. It's kind of like investing. You're making an investment in these projects, and you want to make sure you have a good return on your investment. And you also want to make sure that, first and foremost, and you're going to hear this from me for every time I come and talk to you, I truly believe in what's called place-based economic and community development. And that means that you start with a vision and you stay true to that vision. And you thread that vision through all your projects, through your development plans, through your general plan, through your overall community integration plans, and you stay true to that vision. And if you get a project that doesn't align with your vision, your overall vision, and it's going to have a negative impact on your tax base because you get excited, you're afraid you're going to lose a developer, that is not a good first step to take. Your first step is establishing that vision and really determining who You are. Mind your narrative. And this is a way that you can get out in front of your public and allow them to participate in the development process. Find out what your public wants overall long term. Now, if your public comes back to you and says, we want absolutely no development, well, that's not the right answer. And I'm sorry, because we don't live in that world. That's antiquated. You have to move forward because you are pulling in $288,000 a year in property tax. And that's not sustainable. So you have to move forward in a way that everyone, or at least the majority, feels comfortable moving forward and making sure you put that vision out there first. And if the developers can't conform to the vision, I guarantee you there's one right behind them that can. You just have to be patient and you have to be strategic. Oh, I love that you brought this up. Malcolm, pull up that other slide I have. I wasn't going to go into this, but if you guys want to stick around, we'll take the deep dive. It's this other one. It's got a bunch of circles on it. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna go quick and dirty, but if you guys want me to come back, we can do it slow and steady. Yeah. Okay. Yes, that's coming up. So just keep, and we'll let the mayors know when that's happening. Okay, this is my development project flow chart. I have gone through the fire to create this. Trust me. You can't throw out a scenario and I will tell you I've been through it. Start with your vision. Create a strategic plan with your community. Then this is one of the most important steps in any development project. That is doing your studies. You want to make sure that you're doing feasibility, fiscal impact, engineering studies, environmental studies prior to any action taken to begin work on the projects. This is your due diligence step. So this one and this one are critical for overall development. And you can use them not just for your overall development, you can use them for individual projects, like put your individual project through this process. Then you figure out, is this financially feasible and how do we want to participate financially with this? What's our return on investment from this project if we opt in to using any of the public finance tools? Then you want to make sure you're being really transparent with your general public. Hey guys, we've done our due diligence. We like this project. Here's what we're doing. And you market that project to your community and get your community buy-in and feedback. This is bottom-up development. It is not top-down development. This is coming from the bottom up, not the top down. Then you create your implementation plan. You have someone that manages that project all the way through from top to bottom, someone from your city staff. You track that project. You provide updates to your community on that project. And then you make sure you have a maintenance and operation plan in place. What happens after the project's created? How does this affect our public works department? How does this affect our police department? How does this affect our utilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That was really quick. Usually this takes like a 3-hour session to do, but I wanted you guys to understand you're here. Start here. Do this next. Identify those project areas that you want to see, like this gentleman right here. He's got a project area that needs this assessment done on it. Then you deal with this. This does not come first. This comes first. I guarantee if you do that, you're looking at community buy-in. You're not going to have some heated meetings. Listen, I created this after I did a project in a little town in Georgia where the city wanted to develop out what they didn't know was a historic Black neighborhood. And they came in and said, hey, guess what? We're going to do a bunch of apartments right here. And we're going to put this retail here. And the community came out, not even kidding, guys. They all had matching t-shirts with big X's on them. And we ended up sneaking out the back as staff because it got violent. The media outlets were there. There was a major protest. I think I had like some PTSD for about 2 months afterwards. And I came up with this. I'm like, we're not doing this again. This is not how we develop communities. We don't develop communities because people were elected and they feel like they have the right to tell other people what they can and can't do. You listen to your community, you create that vision together as a team, you figure out what the strategy is, you do your due diligence, then you decide if it's something you want to participate in from a finance perspective. And then you follow it through to the very end. That's my speech, my stump speech. Yes, I just completed, it's not it's about 4 months. I do 3 sessions. And it's a program that I managed in Georgia I worked for the Municipal League in Georgia, and this is the program I managed. And I've done Harrisville, I've done Huntsville. I'm happy to do that for you guys. But I wouldn't be able to do it until March because legislative session is starting and I have to represent the county at the state legislature. So the earliest I could do it would be March, which is why I popped it up. And my assistant's going out on maternity leave in any day. So, but you guys have a lot of potential. I would love to see you start having a little more community visioning and a little more engagement, talking about what properties you'd like to see, maybe doing some of that general plan update that you and I talked about, and just laying your foundation. And then not only will the developers come knocking, you're going to have to turn them away because you know what you want and you know how you're going to fund it and you know that it'll be successful. The end.